Okay, here's another author, Tom Bober, who is with the Missouri School Library Association in Missouri, and he is an author. He's going to talk about the work that he has done, a lot of work he's done with mutual friends, also with the Library of Congress. So I welcome you, Tom, and why don't you go on and take it away? You have presenter's rights. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Casey. And I appreciate getting the opportunity to visit with y'all for just a little bit today. My name's Tom Bober. I'm an elementary librarian in the suburbs of St. Louis. I'm already back in my school. They don't have to be, but I am for today. And what I'm going to be sharing with you today is actually getting ready for some of the work that you're going to see from me coming up in the year ahead. So in the past, I have done a blog post for Knowledge Quest for AASL, which has been a pairing of picture books and primary sources and how those two things can work together. I've taken a little bit of a break for those. As Casey mentioned, I've done some publishing, and I had a book that I co-authored come out this past year called Parent or oh my goodness, the name of it. They name these books for you and you don't get to name them. It's Primary Sources in Literature, the Perfect Pairing. And it talks about how to take all different kinds of literature and pair it with primary sources. But I want to talk specifically about picture books today because this is where I've kind of started with things. Thank you. Literature and primary sources. Thank you, Zinnia. I appreciate that. Um, but we are going to be starting back up with these blog posts coming out through AASL this year. And this was like perfect spot to kind of preview some things that I'm working on and some of that initial work that's happening. So you're going to see kind of a little bit of the behind the scenes of what I'm starting with. And then if you're following along with me on Knowledge Quest this year, you're going to see many, if not all of these come into fruition in their final form. I'm going to go ahead and share in the chat this presentation so you can take a look at these as well. And all of the primary sources that I'm going to show you in the presentation today are linked in the presentation. So if you want to get to these primary sources and you want to get to them before I do the Knowledge Quest post, you can go to that link that I just shared in the chat and you can get them there. So let me go ahead and share my screen and throw that into slideshow mode. There we go. So we're going to look at all of these picture books I'm talking to you about today are 2024 titles. I'm lucky because I'm sitting on the Notable Books committee this year. I'm chairing that committee. And so we've got basically almost every day, I've got a box of books showing up in front of my house. And we've got some great nonfiction and historically based nonfiction stuff that's coming out that pairs with primary sources. Most of these I'm going to show you today are bios, although a couple of them are not. So let's go ahead and jump in. First one I want to talk to you about is this Erno Rubik and his magic cube. This gives the whole story of how the Rubik's Cube was created, all of the trial, all of the error that was going in. There's some really incredible STEM stuff that's happening in this particular piece. And I think when I went to look for primary sources, what I was finding and what I was really drawn to were some of these early prototypes. And so you get to see kind of the early prototypes of these 4x4s that were built, not all of them by Erno Rubik, some of them by other creators as well. Erno Rubik and the Rubik's Cube is that 3x3 Rubik's Cube. You can see in that little device that's got the screws coming out of it, that was a trial piece for kind of that central core of the cube at one point. And so you get to see kind of how this piece was designed. As I'm thinking about how I might use this with students and what you might see in the blog post coming up, I think this idea gives us a real opportunity not only to explore Rubik's Cube, so we get to explore the cube and get into the idea of solving the cube, but also this idea of design and what are different ways that we might be able to manipulate blocks in a way that would still hold them together. So that little patent drawing in the lower left corner are magnets, but I think there's a lot of other options that are out there too. So I love this idea of bringing this book into like a specialty makerspace idea, and I'm thinking through how that might look right now. All right, so that one's in the works. Next one is Skybound, starring Mary Myers as Carlotta, daredevil aeronaut and scientist. And this is about Mary Myers. She was known kind of publicly as Carlotta, and she, with her husband, were balloonists. And I'll be honest with you, if there's one thing I wish all of my elementary kids left my elementary school knowing historically, there's a lot of things. But from more of kind of like just like a fun to know kind of piece of information, it would be how popular ballooning was at kind of a moment in time historically, and all of the other stuff that was kind of going on around that time period when ballooning was so popular. Of course, when we get into early planes and the Wright brothers and the such, that all kind of starts to decrease. But this was really a time period where there was people who would go to fairs and they'd go see balloonists, and they would be doing stunts off of their balloons at these high altitudes. And you can find all of these newspaper reports about unfortunate accidents that happened, all kinds of amazing things. But the story of Carlotta, I think, leans into how popular ballooning was. And so finding pictures that kind of lean into that was the area that I started going into as I started to look for primary sources. This one picture in the lower left, is of Carlotta in a balloon before it's taking off. I love the crowd scene here, that you can get how many people are actually coming out to see her. Notice that it's a lot of men as well. So she's kind of popular across genders. And then in the upper right corner, her and her husband actually had a ballooning farm, they called it, where they would test different balloons out in like kind of this big field area. And you can see in this particular image, and there's several of them out there, but this particular one, the balloon you can see has her name across the balloon. So you not only see a little bit of the area, but you get to see, in a sense, how popular and important she was, that, they're going to put her name across the balloon. So this is one book that I think I'm going to use for that kind of like what was popular, what was exciting in the moment, and then tie it into all what was going on in history around that time. This next one I have is called Miles of Style, Eunice W. Johnson and the Ebony Fashion Fair. And this is around Eunice Johnson. She's a person, all these people, most of these people, I should say, are new to me, but she is a much more recent figure compared to our last book that we looked at. And she spearheaded this, what she described as an ebony fashion fair, a fashion fair for that was put on and was promoting Black women and men and styles that they may be interested in. And this fashion show crossed the country at the time that it went on. It was extremely popular for years and years and years, and then slowly died out. But we get a peek into not only what started that fair, but also kind of the peak of what was fashionable at that time. I have a lot of students who love fashion, who love seeing what fashion is and was popular. And I think promoting that through Johnson's work is a way that I can garner a lot of interest from my upper elementary students. What I am still looking for here is images of Johnson's work and Johnson's fashion that she was putting together that's in color, because that resonates a lot more with students, especially when we're talking about clothing. But what I've been able to find so far are several black and white photographs that are in newspapers. Typically, these are African-American newspapers that were run at the time, but from across the country. And you can see here in this description that you do have color descriptions going on in some of them, but you don't necessarily have the color imagery. So this is one I'm still digging in on, because I think those color images are going to give a way for my students to connect to this person and what she did in a much deeper and more relative way. But if push comes to shove, I can make these images, these primary sources work as well. All right, our next book, oops, I think, oh, I accidentally clicked through. Sorry, hold on one second. There we go. Our next book is Charles and Ray, Designers at Play. And this book is actually about a couple who were both designers. And they did design all types of things, but one thing that they focus in on heavily in this particular book is their design of chairs. And that chair in the upper left is kind of like their most popular, their most well-known chair. And one thing they were known for was this idea of taking wood and pressing it to shape it into various shapes. So this is like thin wood that is, I believe, if I remember from the book correctly, like heated and then shaped into various shapes to give it that kind of smooth, curved look. If you look in the upper right, that idea came from another design that they did, which was to create splints for soldiers. And they had read that the soldiers, when they would injure themselves, would have splints that were uncomfortable. And so they said, well, can we take this machine that we have to actually bend plywood to fit the leg? And so they made kind of these form-fitting splints that were much better for injured soldiers at the time. They took that same idea, applied it to their chair, and were off to the races. This is some other chairs that they designed, and a lot of these chairs are available through images are available through MoMA. And I think this idea of getting kids to kind of design their own chair, potentially build that as well, and kind of another makerspace opportunity is another thing that we're going to be looking at as an activity. So you can kind of see that a lot of what I've been leaning into lately takes a picture book, historically based, takes the historically based primary sources, and then leads us into like a makerspace activity. That's kind of a lot of what I've been doing lately with my kids and what I'm going to be showing and promoting a lot through these blog posts coming up. This next one is not a biography, but it is a kind of historically based nonfiction book. And this one's called Dive, the Story of Breathing Underwater. And it goes into a lot of different directions around how individuals are breathing underwater. You can see scuba gear on the front here, but one area that they also get into that I personally find fascinating, and it's another kind of area of history that's maybe a little bit lesser known to at least my students, and that's the use of diving bells. I mentioned I'm in the suburbs of St. Louis. We're right on the Mississippi and the Missouri, and a lot of our bridge building in the area historically were done using diving bells. And so helping students understand what that actually looked like, how those were utilized, I think is something that this book allows us to do a little bit more. It gives us not only through the descriptions and the illustrations, but an avenue to kind of dive into some primary sources. So the primary sources here, you can see I've got a couple of different illustrations, one of them a photograph of a diving bell, and you get a little bit of that perspective. Another one of a drawing of a diving bell. I love that because you can see the size of it and what was actually able to fit inside of it. And then in the upper left corner, that's actually a piece of a news script that was used around a diving bell. You can see it's like a 35-second script piece. But it again gives a description of the diving bell. So having students do an analysis of this as an understanding piece, and potentially then even going into some aspects of the bridge building that happened in Missouri, or on the, in the rivers around St. Louis, I think would be a really fun activity. And it's kind of where my head is right now with that one. Our next book is Bird Girl. Jean Stratton Porter shares her love of nature with the world. And this is around Jean S. Porter, and she was much more of a nature enthusiast, a nature writer. But what she discovered was that as she was trying to write and get published, that the publishers didn't have a good way to show what she was trying to describe. And so magazines would, for example, try to use taxidermied birds, but the positioning would be wrong, and she would realize that this was problematic. And then she discovered photography, and she realized, oh, I can actually take photos of birds and couple them with my writing. And so she ends up in some ways being just as recognized for her photography, and this is kind of where the book is focused on, as she was in her writing. These are a couple of images that we have that are show some pictures that she has. I think that's actually a baby vulture on the left, and that's actually mentioned in the book. And then on the right, I was able to find through some digging an article and image that were actually from her and a piece of her writing. And this is very early 1900s. I think this is 1900 or 1901, and the photograph that accompanied it. I think with this activity, I love the idea of students making observations around what might and thinking around what might be challenging around making this kind of photography. Of course, getting this close and be able to photograph a bird that's still, and then actually taking out the iPads out into some nearby nature that we have nature-ish around our school, and doing a little bit of photography ourselves. So trying to notice some things that this photographer is doing and apply it into our own nature photographs, I think would be a really interesting thing. I'm getting ready to hopefully talk with our science teacher and do a little collaboration with her on this and see where this can fit in, because I'm sure we've got kids who are making scientific or nature observations. We want to tie it in with that. So we're going to do a little collaboration there. Our next book is called The Painter and the President, Gilbert Stuart's Brush with George Washington. This is about a very famous, maybe the most famous portrait of George Washington, probably because it's actually the painting that the dollar bill, that George Washington on the dollar bill is based on. It's actually based on this famous portrait. You can see that portrait up in the upper left where George Washington sat for Gilbert Stuart, and you can see that Gilbert Stuart actually never even finished the painting. He kind of got as far as he wanted to, and then he stopped. And part of the reason he stopped is because he actually then started creating copy after copy after copy of that painting to then sell and make money. So he got what he wanted out of the president. The president George Washington got a painting out of it as well. But what I think is the most fascinating when I look at primary sources related to this book is not necessarily Gilbert Stuart's painting. And this painting can be found at the National Portrait Gallery, and it's actually shared with another museum as well. And the name's blanking. I'm blanking on the name right now. But what I find more fascinating are the people who used Gilbert Stuart's painting to then do their own painting or artwork of the president. So all of these other three pieces of art are actually not created by Gilbert Stuart, but they were created by people who were looking at Gilbert Stuart's painting of George Washington and then creating their own painting. And you can see that there are definitely some differences here. I grabbed ones that I thought were maybe a little more off from the original. And I love this idea of kind of copying someone else's artwork to practice your own artwork. Again, I'm looking at a collaboration with our art teacher and where this might come into play. Part of this is me remembering myself as a kid and loving comic books, but then also spending some of my time just drawing the comic book art based off of the artist that was creating the superhero that I was reading. And I felt like this was kind of another version of that was going on in the late 1700s. So this is where my head is right now with this particular piece. All of these images can be found on the Smithsonian Learning Lab. And there's dozens of others there as well, dozens of other copies of Gilbert's work. Next one that I have is this book called Pedal Balanced Steer, Annie Londonderry, the first woman to cycle around the world. Annie was given I guess took a bet, really, took a wager. Can she cycle around the world? And there were all these parameters that she had to meet. She could only speak English to people. She had to make $5,000 in her journey. And there were other things that she could do, of course, like travel by boat at certain instances and that kind of thing as well. And then if she did all of that, she would make $10,000. She did make it. She did make it all the way around the world. And there was a lot of boating involved, and she had a limited amount of time. I think it was 15 months, if I remember correctly from the book. And where I'm headed with this one in my head is looking at what was the newspaper coverage of this? What could I find in newspaper coverage? And what does that tell us? What did the author decide to leave out? What else can we figure out about Annie and her journey? And so that's kind of where my head is going right now with this particular piece. The book does give a large chunk of the story that takes place in France because there were just some obstacles that Annie overcame there. I'm also planning and hoping to veer into some French newspapers and see if I can find some articles about Annie in the French newspapers during this time period. work with somebody at my middle school or high school to get those translated and work with those as well. But I love the idea of seeing what was reported on, what's another part of the story that this 32-page picture book isn't necessarily able to dive into. Next one that I have is this book called The Girl Who Figured It Out, the inspiring true story of wheelchair athlete Minda Dentler becoming an Ironman world champion. This is incredibly uplifting book. And if you can see, if you look in the lower left corner of the book, you can see that Minda Dentler actually wrote this book as well. So she writes the whole thing in first person, which I think is a really powerful way to tell this story. And I think that what that really led me to, especially given the fact that it's also a much more current story, was what are the other stories that the other times Minda Dentler has told this story and the other ways that Minda Dentler has told this story. So I love bringing this, the idea of bringing this to my middle school or my upper elementary students and saying, let's take a look at multiple ways that an individual can decide to tell their story and look at not only what part of the story might be different, but also how the story might be told differently. So I've got a couple of different things that I've found so far. One is a TED Talk that's in the upper right corner, of course, and there's Minda Dentler telling her story. And then below that is a interview that she gives, and you can see you've got it's transcribed. You get the back and forth between Minda and the interviewer. And I love the idea of having the audiovisual element, having the picture book, the illustrated picture book element, and then just having the text element and bringing all those pieces together. And my next one, I've got two more, I think, is called The Tree of Life, How a Holocaust Sapling Inspired the World. This is a really another, boy, all these stories are ones that I were just completely unaware of. Of course, you and I and so many of us know so much about Holocaust and the concentration camps. This is really a story of hope that around this teacher and these kids that planted this tree, and this tree survived the concentration camps along with some of the individuals who planted it. And the thing that I was left with when I finished the story is just what really kind of the purpose of that moment that in my eyes that I saw, and I saw it again, as I mentioned just a moment ago, as this moment of hope, right? You're planting something. They're literally sacrificing their own water that they have to keep this thing alive and to, in a sense, feed it and help it grow. And so there's this story of hope that is going on here. The two images that you see to the left are two images that were created, two of a few that I found, images that were created by other children or by children at this exact same camp at this exact same time. And I think part of my wondering at the moment is what are the purposes of these? What were they trying to capture? What were they trying to convey at that moment? And is there a word like we use hope to like I use the word hope, and maybe my students might choose a different word, but the word hope to attach to this act of planting and caring for this tree, is there a different word that we could attach to this other things that were created, that were cared for, that were nurtured in a sense? Because obviously these aren't quick pieces of artwork. These are things that they really worked on at that moment. And how can that help us to kind of understand the really complex life and that these people were living at that moment when they were in these horrible conditions, and yet there's still opportunity for hope. There's still opportunity for art. How would that feel? How would that resonate? What does that mean? How does that help us understand these individuals as more three-dimensional than maybe we might have understood them before, when they were just kind of like these people that were in this concentration camp? Again, still fleshing out exactly what this looks like, but that's where my thinking is at the moment. And then my last one is this one. It's Jose Feeds the World, How a Famous Chef Feeds Millions of People in Need Around the World. And just as much as this is a biography, this is really also kind of almost an origin story for World Central Kitchen. If you're familiar with that organization and the work that they do, they certainly have been in the news lately, sometimes for tragic reasons. But I think that this particular book is an avenue for older students to dive into World Central Kitchen and see the role that they are playing in some world events that are happening right now. So I'm thinking about students who are studying kind of present day history in a sense, right? The history that's being written day to day to day. And does this look at World Central Kitchen and their role give us another way to look at those individual or look at this organization? And does this picture book give us an avenue to kind of an entry point towards kind of the origin of this organization, something a little more personable than maybe kind of their story that they have on their website, but some other areas of their website being ones that give us a look at the broader work that they do and how it ties into essentially the history of the moment. And again, kind of this opportunity to see history not just as events, but also seeing history as people influencing and connecting with and supporting other people. I think all of those things can be really impactful, and I think this is potentially an avenue to do that. So let me go ahead and stop sharing, friends. That is my time, and I'm actually like right up against it. But I just want to share a little bit of my thinking and what you're going to see hopefully in the months ahead here on Knowledge Quest. And again, all that material is all those sites are available through that primary sources available through that link that I shared earlier in the chat. Casey, I'm gonna come back to you.
Tom, you have just increased my number of books I'm gonna be reading this summer, especially the nonfiction titles. Woo! Those nonfiction titles were just unreal. And some of them I recognize, and I didn't know anything about that Johnson title. I just want that for myself, personally. I do want to make a comment about that Eunice Johnson. You might want to cross-reference Moneta Sleet and Gordon Parks because they were the prominent photographers during that time for Ebony magazine. And I would just pick up the phone, call Ebony, and just ask them about the digitized past issues and pictures and see if they can help you from there. I would just call the office in Chicago.
It's so you're 100% right. Just sometimes calling someone, especially when you're saying, "Here's how I'm
Yeah.
trying to use it," and help educators out there. Boy, it just opens doors to make the phone calls. And one thing that I do, Casey, when I put these posts out, is I make sure every primary source I'm sharing is nothing that's behind like a paid wall or anything else. This is all
Yeah.
stuff that's freely available. But sometimes stuff that is behind a paid wall, and I imagine maybe some of that might be sometimes they're willing to open, crack the door a little bit for educators in those instances.
Yeah, yeah, because it's got to be another way to find those images because there are tons of them. All the work that she did during that time. Hey, y'all, give Tom some love in the chat. Well, they've been giving it to you all throughout your presentation because everybody was recognizing a lot of the titles and they were like, oh, I remember that book. And oh, yeah, you have some good ones on your list. So thank you so much for taking the time out. And I know you're trying to set up for the next school year, right?
Well, a little bit, but I appreciate, honestly, this is kind of my professional joy is getting in here and getting a chance to not only do this work, but share this work. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you. And let us know next time you have another book coming out because, we'll be right there waiting for it. All right.
Thanks,
Take care,
Casey.
man. All righty. Ooh, that was good.